Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning for our episode this morning for our series, The ABCs of CLC. CLC again standing for Cultural and Linguistic Competence. This morning we're going to be taking a look at terminology in regards to the LGBTQ plus community. So before we get started, I want to revisit a couple of items that you may have seen before if you've seen some of our other ABCs of CLC webinar episodes. The overall purpose of this entire series is to just provide some very basic foundational clarification on some common terms that you may come across in different trainings regarding cultural competence or linguistic competence, so that when you then attend more thorough trainings on working with specific populations or actual application of this information, you can kind of be on the same page about what these terms mean. Sometimes in trainings that are about actual application, actually, changing our approach with different populations, terminology may be just very quickly reviewed at the beginning. And if folks don't come in with a fairly solid understanding or somewhat an understanding of what these words mean, that can be kind of difficult to keep up with and really have a solid understanding of, and then to keep up with the presenter throughout the rest of the time what they're talking about. So we really just want to offer this series to provide a very friendly, basic 101 level exploration of clarifying these terms. This is technically intended for use before using other trainings that we put out, but we think that this information will be beneficial in any cultural competence training that you might attend, and hopefully will eventually lead to some positive changes in how we approach various populations. Some different uses for today's episode and all the episodes in our series to learn either for the first time or review current terminology. Again, that's basically what this is all about. We also hope to inspire deeper learning. We do not want the idea out there at all that after this webinar episode you are going to have achieved competence or anything like that. That's not even possible. Competence is an ongoing process that one can never achieve. We need to continually be learning, continually have a state of mind of humility, of cultural humility. So we hope that from here you'll be inspired to tune into other resources, whether it comes out of Texas System of Care or elsewhere. And then also, honestly, to raise some potential red flags of your current knowledge. If today is completely new information, if you come away from this webinar today with things still just kind of clear as mud type of a thing, please don't be frustrated. Please don't be distressed by that. But take that seriously, that there's some serious need, there's some serious red flags there, to make sure that you continue in your learning and in your understanding of whatever specific population is being discussed. Today's population is of course the LGBTQ plus community. A little bit of a disclaimer before we actually do start digging into some of the terminology and some of the concepts and some of the ideas today, is language changes. That's the name of the game, and this is not only in regards to terms regarding different cultural groups or different identities. This is just in general the nature of language. Sometimes folks have an attitude of language that it is this fixed kind of dogmatic thing that we as a society have to adhere to the rules and standards of. It's actually the reverse of that. Language is a reflection of the societal values of a particular group. And so as a society will change, as a culture will change, the language that is needed for communication is also going to change. We can see that, take any language, take English. We used to talk in Old English. Now we don't talk that way any longer. We really need to have a little bit of an attitude of flexibility when we do have these changes that occur. Sometimes it may seem like new words are popping up left and right, and that may be, for some folks, aligned with the actual new identities or new thoughts or new emotions or whatever the case may be. Particularly in regards to the LGBTQ community, I kind of want to have a clarification there as well. Just because a word in the English language has not always existed all the way back to when we were talking in Old English doesn't mean that that concept, that idea, that object, that identity wasn't around previously. That's not what that means. So to kind of, strike that idea home a little bit more, take the word love. In English, that's the word that we have. We have one word, love, to describe this emotion that we have towards romantic partners, that we have towards our moms, towards our parents, the love that we have for our pets, the love that we have for dear friends. It's all just one word. Other languages have different words to describe these different types of love. You'll have a different word to describe love for a romantic partner versus for a dear friend versus a sacrificial type of love. In English, we just all call it one thing. Now, does that mean that English speakers feel the same sensation towards these different relationships because it's only one word, so it must be the same thing? No, of course that's not what that means. Of course, the love that you feel for your romantic partner is different than what you feel towards your children, is different than what you may feel towards your mother. We just use all one word for that. So when it may seem or appear like there's like new words popping up, please understand that that's not a reflection of new realities, of new identities, of people behaving in different ways, in ways that they haven't for centuries and centuries. It's just really more a reflection of, in our society in the US today, even though there is still a lot of discrimination and oppression in regards to this community, there's also been, in recent years, more openness, more empowerment for individuals to truly get to express themselves and identify according to their genuine sexual orientation and or gender identity. And we're gonna talk, of course, today about sexual orientations and gender identities. But I feel like that's a really, really important thing to have down and understand. A lot of times in conversations with folks, people do tend to get frustrated, again, in general, whenever there's any change in terminology. But we need to be flexible, and we need to make sure that we are validating others. A little bit of kind of like a lame, picture of this type of a thing, I'm just going to put it out there anyways, is let's say that you had a friend, a very, very close friend, who never had a name. Their whole life, they were never named as a child, and they're just nameless. You call them, hey, you, or, what's going on? Just never address them with a name at all, and that's what you're very, very accustomed to. And then that person finally gets to go through the process of having officially, under the law and so on and so forth, an actual name, and your friend comes up to you and says, my name is Susan. I would like you to address me as Susan. This feels, this is who I am. If your reaction to that were anything other than celebrating, then you're not a very supportive friend. If your reaction to that were to be, oh, now I have to get used to calling you Susan. See, I just did it again. You're you. That's what I've always called you, always. I know that's a really, really silly comparison, but just for the idea of it's okay to not grow in our knowledge with this community because it's confusing and it's complicated and it's hard to keep straight and I'm not used to it type of a thing, you're not being very supportive in that instance. So if you are a mental health professional, if you're an administrator, if you are a supportive person in the life of a youth, whatever role that you may play in the life of a youth who identifies as LGBTQ+, this is important. It's not the equivalent of, calling someone Susie instead of Susan because it's a slight preference. It gets at the root of who this person is in a very, very intimate, very, very important way. And not having this type of knowledge is not going to equate into appropriate care and support. So let's start getting into it a little bit. We did in our first episode of this series that was titled This versus That, we did talk a little bit about the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity, and there you can see some of the other this versus that's that we went over. But I do want to visit that again because this is something that a lot of folks will confuse, is sexual orientation and gender identity. So we're going to revisit our friend, the gender unicorn, and later on we're going to visit a very similar image as well. Now this is really kind of a teaching tool that is helpful at this very, very basic level. Please know that the gender unicorn and other images that are out there don't encompass every possibility, every possible identity within the LGBTQ community, but it is a really good starter point to try to start to tease out some of these different elements of sexual orientation, different elements of gender identity and gender expression that can be confusing at first. So here again, we can see different categories shown here on the gender unicorn. There's gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, who you're physically attracted to, and who you're emotionally attracted to. We're going to get to some of the gender elements a little bit later. Right now I want to focus on those last two categories. We'll zoom in on that a little bit. For sexual orientation and attraction, who you're physically attracted to and who you're emotionally attracted to. Oftentimes for a lot of people that can be one and the same in regards to romantic partners or life partners, but there are different types of attraction. So when we start to get into this topic of sexual orientation, I do want to take a few minutes to dissect attraction itself a little bit more. So there are a few different types of attraction. A lot of times when we talk about sexual orientation, different types of attraction, people jump to sexual attraction. It's all about sex, it's all about sex, it's all about sex. Folks, it is not all about sex. When we're talking about sexual orientation, yes, that word sexual is kind of there in that title of the category, but there are so many different types of attraction that exist. The first of all being emotional attraction. This is genuinely just the desire to get to know someone at a more intimate level. This is not connected necessarily with any sexual or romantic attraction. You feel emotional attraction with your friends. You feel emotional attraction with coworkers who it's not just show up to the office and get the job done, but you go out to lunch, you get to know the person, get to know about their family, about their interests. This is the attraction of, trying to get to know someone at a more intimate emotional level, and it ranges from platonic friendships all the way to romantic partners. Then there's the romantic attraction. This is when you want to experience some romance with another person. Pretty self-explanatory there. This is kind of the lovey-dovey hand-holding portion of attraction. Then there's aesthetic attraction. This is pure aesthetic attraction, is just the appreciation for the beauty of a person. So the image that is shown here, this is actually kind of a combination of aesthetic attraction and romantic. A more accurate aesthetic attraction would be someone just appreciating a human form for what it is without any kind of sexualized ties to it. So maybe appreciating a statue of a woman or a statue of a man or other human form, just for the aesthetic form, for the aesthetic beauty, not tied to sex, not tied to romance necessarily. In this picture, the reason that I chose this one is partly because it's really cute from Little Rascals, and also partly because, to be honest, this might sound a little dorky, but when I started looking for different pictures of like artistic statues and all that, I didn't want to perpetuate like one ideal of what beauty is or what, is aesthetically pleasing or what have you. So I just kind of went for this one instead. Then there's intellectual attraction. For this, we can kind of think of like coffee talk. Like this is where you kind of want to just get to know someone at an intellectual level. You are attracted to having discourse that kind of gets to what they're thinking intellectually. Get to know someone by their mind. You're more attracted by their mind than necessarily you are, physically. It doesn't have to do with that physical piece so much. Of course, you can have different types of attractions for the same person at the same time. Then we have sensual attraction. Now I know it probably looks weird at first to have the word sensual and then have a picture of dogs, because again, this is a type of attraction that oftentimes gets sexualized when it doesn't, it's not necessarily a sexual thing, though it could be. So sensual is just that tactile, not combined with romance, not combined necessarily with emotional attraction, not necessarily combined with sexual attraction. It's really just you want to have that touch. So I put an example of some cute dogs because, you know, for me, I'm very, very much into cuddling with my dog. Like, he's so cute, he's so fuzzy, just want to cuddle with him. That is, I know it sounds weird because we sexualize this word a lot, but that is sensual attraction. I am not sexually attracted to my dog. You make that clear. I'm not romantically attracted to my dog. Because he's my dog, there might be a little bit of emotional with that as well. But, you know, if I cuddle with my dog, or if I cuddle with my husband, who is equally cute and adorable, and I just want to, you know, with my husband, I may have some intersection of like romance going on with the sensual attraction. But these are very different things going on, okay? And then last one that we're going to go over today, we're not necessarily going over every single type of attraction that exists, is sexual attraction. Can't show you all a picture of that. I'm sorry. It's exactly what you think it is. And this is exactly what folks think we're talking about anytime we talk about sexual orientation or, you know, supporting LGBTQ youth or anything like that. Folks think that these conversations are all about sexual attraction, and, you know, sometimes it may include that element, but sexual orientation is so much more than that sexual attraction piece. Yes, it includes that when the individual is at a point in their life where that is like developmentally appropriate, but especially when we're talking about youth, to be perfectly honest, a lot of the times we're not necessarily talking about that sexual attraction piece. We're talking about some of these other attractions that are incorporated into the identity of the individual, that whenever that person goes through the, you know, developmentally appropriate phase of sexual development, you know, it'll get there. But it doesn't look any different for LGBTQ youth than it necessarily does for youth who do not identify as LGBTQ. So an example of this, my first crush, and y'all, I'm being very vulnerable, put myself out there today, was way back in kindergarten. I had a crush on a classmate named Andrew, and I just thought he was cute. I just thought he was adorable. He had a unibrow that I didn't notice at the time. I didn't hold that against him. I thought he was cute. I thought he was nice. I wanted to hold his hand. And it was just adorable, cute little, not reciprocal, but kind of like puppy love type of a thing that was totally appropriate and adorable for a 5-year-old little girl. I was not a sexual being. I did not have sexual desires of Andrew, my little kindergarten classmate at the time. It was totally appropriate, totally developmentally appropriate. And I think that this is an important clarification, again, because this is an area where a lot of times folks are talking past each other. Some are talking about supporting LGBTQ youth in a very holistic way, supporting, you know, their place in the world and their true identity for who this youth is, supporting that cute little puppy love for whoever they have that cute little puppy love towards, you know, supporting the little, you know, 10-year-old dates with the parent chaperones, and supporting the cute little hand holding, and supporting the homecoming dances and the prom dances and all that stuff that you think as being very typical milestones throughout a child's life as they are kind of learning who they are and what their place is in the world. It's just that in the case of sexual orientation, where that puppy love is directed looks different. But it is equally appropriate, it is equally developmentally appropriate. And we do this all the time. We talk about kiddos' sexual orientation all the time without realizing it. We just do it in a way that assumes that kiddos are going to grow up, you know, straight and being attracted to the opposite gender. So for example, you know, if you have an 11-year-old son who you notice he starts to kind of like flirt a little bit with the cute girl down the street or something like that, and you start to tease him like, oh yeah, do you like Andrea? Like, that type of thing. You're discussing your child's sexual orientation with them. You're doing it in a way without necessarily naming it. And you're also sending affirming messages for that sexual orientation, or at least that assumed sexual orientation that would properly, you know, describe your son. So we do have these talks, we do have these messages all the time. We just do it in a way that assumes that kiddos are going to grow up to be straight and that kiddos are going to grow up to be cisgender, which we'll talk about that in a minute, but that's essentially when the sex you're assigned at birth matches your gender identity. So we actually do have these conversations all the time. So having said that, and having gone through a little bit of clarification of what we mean when we talk about sexual orientation, I want to talk about some of the different types of sexual orientation, some of the different labels and descriptions that you may hear. We're not going to go over every single possible one that exists. There are many. But sexual orientation, again, is about who you are attracted to in relation to who you are. So there is a little bit of an intersection of needing to understand gender identity, which we'll get to in a second. But for example, if you are a woman and you're attracted to a man, or if you are a man and you're attracted to a woman, then you know you would be considered straight. We're probably pretty familiar with that. Some others that there's probably pretty good familiarity with is lesbian and gay. Gay is when you're attracted to the same gender. So if you're male and you're attracted to another male, or if you're female and you're attracted to another female, then that is considered gay. If you are a female attracted to another female, then you can also use the term lesbian for that. And those are terms that are most folks tend to have pretty down pat and have a good understanding of. There's also bisexual, where you can have sexual attraction towards either male or female. There's also pansexual, which this gets into needing an understanding of different gender identities, where you are attracted to any potential sex or gender identity that you know can exist. So this goes into things that we'll get into a little bit, like gender fluid or gender queer. This also, pansexual, is attracted to transgender men and transgender women, whereas you know, if you are lesbian, you may potentially only be attracted to cisgender lesbians and not to transgender lesbians. But if you are a transgender female attracted to another female, then you are a lesbian, as that's separate from your gender identity. And then another identity is something called asexual. That's where a person doesn't necessarily have a sexual attraction towards another person, but they may still experience different types of attraction that we looked at earlier today. They may still experience romantic attraction, emotional attraction. They may still you know, have life partners, but that sexual attraction is not necessarily a piece for asexual. So those are a few different types of sexual orientation that exist. Again, your sexual orientation is all about who you are attracted to. Oops, skipped one. So now we're going to take a look at gender a little bit more. But before we do, I want to go over some gender talk. So you already heard me start referring to some things, because even though gender identity and sexual orientation are different, sometimes it's hard when you're talking about one to not bring in discussions or clarifications about the other. So first of all, you heard me say already this morning, sex assigned at birth. That is the appropriate way to phrase that scenario of when a baby is born, the doctor takes a look and they assign either male or female based on what they see, or in the case of babies that are born intersex, They may make a judgment call with the parents. It used to be that pretty much every time they would choose for the baby, essentially, whether to consider the male or female, go through, whatever operations are needed in that case. Now there's kind of more knowledge and awareness of intersex babies and more of an understanding of, that it might be appropriate to wait and see which gender the child identifies with. But sex assigned at birth is really the appropriate way to word it. You may have heard when we talk about, transgender individuals or intersex individuals, you may hear people talk about like biological sex or like real sex or something like that. That's really not appropriate, because first of all, with the example of biological sex, that for intersex individuals may not be accurate. And then for transgender individuals, that's really putting too much emphasis into what anatomically is going on with that individual, and is really not validating of that person's genuine gender identity. So we describe this as sex assigned at birth. That is the proper way to phrase this. You also heard me say before cisgender. This is because everyone has a gender and has a gender identity. This is folks who, when their sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity. So sex assigned at birth was female, identifies as female, that's cisgender. Sex assigned at birth was male, identifies as male, that's also cisgender. Also, we need to be aware of different pronouns. When we talk about different types of gender identities, we're probably all pretty familiar with he, him, his, or she, her, hers. Those are the masculine pronouns and the feminine pronouns. There are some other pronouns that are used to be gender neutral or even gender queer. One is ze, here, hers. That is considered a gender neutral, set of pronouns to use for a person in place of he, him, his, or in place of she, her, hers. You can also use they, them, theirs. Again, that's kind of a gender neutral way to go. Some folks may be using a mixture with their pronouns. So some folks are completely comfortable with using either he, him, his, or she, her, hers. That pronoun combination very much fits with that person's identity. Other folks, if they don't prefer just one type, they might say, either he, him, his, or they, them, theirs. Or they might say either she, her, hers, or ze, here, hers. You really don't know necessarily what pronouns people prefer until you hear it from them, type of a thing. Some people do not want a mixture at all. They very, very much want the one set of pronouns to be used to reflect their identity. Other folks want a mixture. Now, need to do a cultural humility check here, because this is definitely a point where some people, again, get a little frustrated and get a little bit of an attitude of, ugh, type of a thing. This is incredibly, incredibly important. Again, this is not the equivalent of like someone named Susan getting upset because you call her Susie, type of thing. You should honor everyone's names. Of course, that's important. But this is like very, very integral to the person's identity, how they move through the world, how they experience the world, and it really needs to be honored. If you mess up on this because it's new and you're not accustomed to it, do the best you can and correct yourself whenever possible. If you have, if you know someone who prefers they, them, theirs, and you accidentally say, she or he or something that person does not prefer, catch yourself as soon as possible and grow and get better every day and making sure that you're using the pronouns that person requests. The last option for pronouns is whatever the person uses. There are definitely other kind of pronoun sets out there that exist. Again, just get your cues from the individual on what pronouns they use, okay? Again, I can't stress enough that this is not just kind of like a whatever slight preference. Even in the case where folks identify using a mixture, it's not because, it doesn't matter if you use he or they. It's because both he and they properly address the identity of this person. So even in the case where there's mixtures, that's not to say that it's lackadaisical or lazy, or it doesn't matter. It very much matters. It's just that there's more than one that fits, and that would be appropriate. Now, this is the genderbread person, which is a very, very similar image to what we saw before with the gender unicorn. Again, it kind of shows the different elements of identity, attraction, gender expression, and sex, or sex assigned at birth. Just like before we zoomed in on the sexual attraction part, I want to zoom in on the gender identity part. I want to emphasize again that this is a learning tool. It does not accurately encompass everything within the LGBTQ plus community, but it is very helpful to start to learn of genders that exist outside of cisgender male and cisgender female. So these arrows here that under the first one go from non-gendered over towards womanness or manness. You can also imagine this as these arrows being out in a horizontal manner with the extreme they have here is womanness and manness on either side, and then that kind of non-gendered in the middle type of a thing. Womanness referring to femininity, manness here referring to masculinity. Some of the words on here as well sometimes are more learning tools than they are necessarily the ways that folks may identify. So for example, someone definitely can identify as non-gendered, but there are other words that people might use to describe that more often. I don't often hear folks referring to themselves as non-gender, but you might hear things like non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender queer, just in general, to describe not being necessarily on the binary of masculinity and femininity. You can see that they list a few different possibilities for gender, and I also want to make clear with this, the little stars that are supposed to rate how masculine or how feminine the gender identity is of the individual, that's just an example of potentially one individual who identifies as female, where those stars could be. So someone who identifies as a woman, there you can see where the stars are as far as womanness and manness. You can be a woman and the stars be in different spots, right? But you can just see from that the point is that typically for someone who identifies as a woman, the femininity is probably going to be up higher than the masculinity, though not always. So we have a transgender woman as someone whose sex assigned at birth was male, and now they identify as, or now they have been empowered to truly identify according to their true identity as a woman, okay? That oftentimes is going to align with gender expression, which is how you express gender. If you dress and kind of carry yourself in a way that is very feminine or very masculine, or neither of those are outside of that, your gender identity is who you are and how you identify. Your expression is how you express that. So some folks may, for various different reasons, their identity may be as a woman, but maybe they're expressing themselves still in very masculine ways. Maybe because that person was assigned the gender of being male at birth, and even though they identify as a woman, due to societal conditions, they do not feel safe to have a gender expression that matches their gender identity. So sometimes there can be definitely a disconnect between those two things. That's why we teach them a little bit differently as well. Some other gender identities that you can see here. I talked about non-binary and non-conforming that would be not necessarily on the scale of masculinity towards femininity. Also, gender queer is kind of a catch-all umbrella term that can mean different, specific things for different people. Gender queer can mean that you're somewhere in the middle of this binary as it's shown here. Or it can mean that you're even completely off of the binary. Exactly what genderqueer means is going to be different for the individual person. Something else here under gender identity that we haven't gone over yet that you'll see there is two-spirit. This is a gender identity that comes out of American Indian tribes or indigenous tribes. This is a gender identity that pre-colonization period in a number of different tribal nations, not necessarily all, because remember, every tribal nation is a completely unique and distinct group of people, but in many, it's estimated roughly 150 plus tribes in North America prior to colonization had two-spirit individuals. This is a different gender identity. It's distinct from being cisgender male or cisgender female. And depending on the specific tribe, sometimes two-spirit folks were celebrated, were considered because they had this two-spirit, this feminine spirit and this masculine spirit, to be in some ways not superior is not exactly the right word, but to be more in tuned with, you know, both males and females, so with all of humanity, could be medicine people, that type of a thing. I'm really generalizing this a lot because it really does vary from tribe to tribe on how exactly this identity would express itself. Post colonization, this identity is not nearly as celebrated within tribal communities as it once was. And again, the current state of two-spirit individuals within their own communities really differs. There has been some recent years, some reclaiming of this identity in other tribes. This is not an identity that is celebrated any longer. So it really varies. The needs, the treatment needs, the support system needs of two-spirit people is definitely something that there's a growing understanding of the need for strong support and the unique needs that are there. Gender expression, like I talked about just a little bit, this deals with how you express your gender identity, okay? And again, some people, their gender expression does not line up with their gender identity, oftentimes because of issues of fear of discrimination, so on and so forth. So we typically look at this on a range, a binary range again, but we can go beyond the binary too, of masculinity to femininity, being the extremes, everything in between, and then even off of that binary spectrum on how one expresses themselves. So some folks express themselves in a very feminine fashion, some a very masculine fashion, some kind of in between, like an I'm having trouble saying the word, androgynous, where you can't necessarily pick out if the person is displaying more feminine characteristics or more masculine characteristics, and that's very much on purpose. Again, you know, if you're gender nonconforming or gender queer, you may not necessarily align very strongly towards masculinity or femininity. Some of the terms on here, again, are things that you would not necessarily always use or maybe like kind of community specific type of a thing. So on here it uses like the words like butch or femme. Those are common words within the community. If you're not a member of the community, I would recommend to not use those words to describe someone unless you are very highly involved with the LGBTQ community, though you're not necessarily a member or identify that way. And it's not necessarily because it's a thing where, like, if you're not in the community, you can't say it. There are times when maybe you could say it, but if you are still kind of sorting through the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity, for example, you may not really understand thoroughly the different contexts and the different kind of social cues of when it might be appropriate to use words like that. So, you know, there's really no need to be, you know, describing someone as butch or be describing someone as spend most of the time. Now we get to the acronym question. So hopefully we're able to cover, and I know it's a lot of information, and I did not even get to all the different sexual identities and gender identities that do exist, but a lot of times I do get a question about what acronym to use. So there is not an answer to that. Let me just say that. It really depends. It depends on your organization. It depends on the purpose of the document or the announcement, or whatever it is that you're going to be using an acronym. So let's just dig through this a little bit. So first of all, there are very long inclusive acronyms that exist. The one that I put here, LGBTQQ-IP2SAA, is not the longest one that I've seen, but it's one of the more common long ones, okay? So I have seen longer, but I haven't seen ones longer that are used like consistently across a lot of different organizations. But I have seen this one a few times, perhaps with some of the letters in slightly different order. This stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, pansexual, two-spirit, androgynous, and asexual, okay? And I believe that we went through all of those different words today. So there's a benefit in using a longer acronym because, of course, it's more inclusive, right? However, there are cons to using such a long acronym just in regards of practicality, to be perfectly honest. And also, sometimes it's considered that the queer or using a plus sign can kind of cover and encompass anything that doesn't specifically have a letter listed. So it really has to be a judgment call as far as which acronym you decide to use, or your agency decides to use, based on a number of different things. So I'm going to just talk about a few different considerations that should be in play in the conversation when you're trying to figure out what would be appropriate to use. So first of all, just for your knowledge and understanding, usually LGB, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, and then sometimes the T for transgender is what you'll oftentimes see for data and research. For studies that have been done, usually focus on those specific groups. So either just the LGB if they're focusing only on sexual orientation, or if they're also focusing on transgender population, it'll be LGBT. That's very specific, and you can see in the study that they will say what specific portion of the LGBTQ plus community they were looking at things, like depression rates or suicide rates or what have you. So if you are referencing an overall general consensus from the scientific community on, rates of this, that, or the other thing, then it's probably going to be either LGB or LGBT. That's also the reason why oftentimes from like research institutes or other organizations like that, and on their websites and on their different literature, usually it's LGB if that's their focus population, or the LGBT if that's their focus population. And that comes down to because, the term queer is kind of like a catch-all for anything within this population that is not captured under LGBT. That can be sometimes difficult for the scope of specific studies to figure out through that. And that's like a whole other like soapbox tirade on that as well. So just have that knowledge as far as data and research. The Q and what it stands for and whether or not it's appropriate to include it, that depends on your specific group. As you can see, Q can stand for either queer or questioning. So let's take both of those one at a time. Queer originally started out as a derogatory word that, beginning in roughly the 1980s or so, started to be reclaimed by this population. It is not a reclaimed word as a consensus across everyone in the community. There are still, within the aging LGBTQ population, this is a word that still is very painful for a lot of people who, in their formative years as far as identity, this was not yet reclaimed at all in the community. So there are still certainly folks within the LGBT community who this is a painful word. There are other folks, and it typically is, and this is a generalization, but it typically is, kind of younger and maybe not so young generations of it that aren't quite at that aging population stage yet, where this is a term of empowerment. This is definitely a reclaimed term as queer. And again, it's used as kind of like a catch-all umbrella. It can mean a lot of different things, basically outside of what's already covered on LGBT or whatever's outside of the binary, if we're talking about gender queer, that type of a thing. So have knowledge about what that word queer is likely going to mean to your specific population. Questioning. This isn't so much a term, again, that has come out of the community. It's more kind of a label that others put on youth to try to understand kind of the thought process of what's going on with that youth. So what I mean when I say that is there's very much a general consensus within the LGBTQ community that when it comes to sexual orientation, this is known very, very early on, by the individual. Going back to my example, I very early on was having crushes on Andrew, and I could have very easily early on instead been having crushes on, let's say, Rachel type of a thing. And if that were the case, then it's not necessarily that as an adolescent, I would be questioning that piece of myself as much as I might be struggling with how to reconcile that with negative messages that I might have been receiving from society. So this term questioning came out of folks noticing that during kind of like transitional age range, it may seem like the youth is really, really questioning their sexual orientation. What we know from listening to the community is that's not so much questioning whether or not the person is attracted to so-and-so. It's more, I've received messages that this is not okay my whole life, or, I have this religious belief, this faith belief, and I do believe that, but that seems to go against, who I am in this way, and how to reconcile that. There's a lot of difficulty in trying to reconcile these different negative messages that a lot of our youth grow up with. So questioning is not entirely accurate for what a lot of our youth are going through, but it's kind of a label that's thrown on. And to be completely honest, it's something that we say to make like cisgender straight folks feel a little more comfortable sometimes, like all the kiddos just like questioning type of a thing. So again, for that type of cue for the questioning, you need to have some conversations and dialogue about what that would mean if you included that. Also, make sure when you're determining what form of an acronym to use, please know what the letters mean. It's great to want to be inclusive, but you need to be very intentional about every single letter that you might include in an acronym. So an example of this, we talked about two-spirit individuals a little bit earlier today. Don't just throw 2S into your acronym. If you don't have a current relationship with any tribal community, you don't plan seriously on having a relationship where you're assisting providing services to a tribal community, you don't have any intention of being serious about supporting two-spirit individuals, then with all due respect, don't you dare just slap that 2S into your acronym. It's good to be inclusive and to send a message by using different letters, but it's also highly disrespectful to just very superficially include those letters that are, again, very integral to people's identities, and then just do nothing to actually even have intentions of genuinely supporting those individuals. So that's not appropriate. Know what the letters mean, know why you're choosing to use them, know why you're choosing to not necessarily choose others, why you're choosing to have queer encompass everything else, or why you're choosing to have a plus to emphasize that, whatever the case may be. Know your agency's flexibility for change. If you don't have to go through a huge red tape bureaucratic process to change things, then you can be pretty responsive to what you're seeing. If you're seeing some of your youth identify in a way that would be an R, but when you Google these acronyms, you don't see an R, go ahead and include the R. Like, why not? Why not be responsive to what you are seeing within your local community there? However, if you are in an entity that it is a much more difficult bureaucratic process to make change, then you need to know that, be aware of it, be very sure that the acronym that you're going to choose at this point in time will hopefully hold up and be respectful to all identities for quite some time. And then lastly, and this kind of feeds into and echoes off of what I've said already, know your community, right? So along with know the letters and what they mean, know your community and how your community is going to perceive, different terms and different words being used and all of that. Maybe you do have a relationship with the tribal community and you have a desire to support 2S individuals, but if you're not having talks with that community about how to do it, then you may not go about it the right way. So know your community. And then finally, I just want to go through a few no-no terms. I didn't want to do any like blatant, slurs. Hopefully there's knowledge about what would be considered completely a slur. But I want to go through some no-no terms that might be kind of surprising to hear about. So first of all is the homosexual community or homosexuality in general. You'll hear this a lot. You'll usually hear it from opponents of the community. This is kind of a sneaky way to highlight that hypersexualized notion of this community and kind of describe the community in a way that was putting labels on the community, going back to times when it was thought that if you're gay, you have a mental illness, things like that. There's a lot of historical roots as far as why this is not an appropriate term to use, and it still is used because it's not to the like badness level of being considered an outright, slur or something like that. You will see folks go on TV and use these terms, all the time, seemingly in a non-controversial way, but it is highly disrespectful. Say LGBT or LGBTQ community or LGBTQ plus, that's actually language that came out of the community itself instead of being put on the community. Talking about preference or lifestyle, again, this is not just like a willy-nilly choice. This isn't like, oh, I like playing basketball, so that's part of my lifestyle, or I slightly prefer this term to this term. This is very much integrated into who the person is. Don't ask, what do your genitals look like, or anything that means that, okay? Most people don't ask this specific wording, but a heck of a lot of people ask questions that are essentially getting at this question. If you're working with a transgender person, youth or adult, this is none of your business. It's none of your business in regards to cisgender people, and it's really not a part of the equation at all in your talks with these individuals, unless for some reason the person wants to bring it up themselves. But, so questions like, oh, are you post-op? Have you had the operation? I see you look this way. What's going on down there? So incredibly inappropriate, to the same level that if someone, I'm a cisgender woman, if someone came up to me and started asking me what I looked like in very private areas of my body, that would be just a complete violation, no different for transgender individuals or transgender youth. So that's not appropriate. Another slightly surprising term, and it's kind of a nuanced one, is saying gendered. We don't say that. It's just gender. It's what gender you are. You're not gendered from the outside. Like gender is like who you are type of a thing. Very nuanced. We talked quite a bit about ignoring someone's pronouns. So of course it's important that we honor and validate and use people's pronouns. And it's not what pronouns they prefer. It's what their pronouns are. And then finally, community only words. Okay. So this is, again, just kind of a wisdom and a judgment call. And it's just a matter of humility and being very honest with yourself at your level of knowledge with this population. If you're at the point where you're still figuring out the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation, you're still kind of trying to wrap your mind around anything that's not completely masculine or completely feminine. If you're struggling with these things, continue in that struggle and continue to learn. But along the way, just be very honest with yourself that you may not have the knowledge to know when to say this or that, the other thing. So a word that I've said in this presentation, queer, that is one that until you gain a little bit more knowledge in how to navigate these conversations, it may be good to not use that word because you may not be using it at the right times. Some other like terminology that you may see here and there, but you really need to know when might be appropriate to use it. MTF for male to female, or FTM for female to male. And any words that kind of come from like a medical perspective type of a thing, try to stick away from that. Again, not because it's always completely 100% inappropriate, but you kind of need to know in which context and with which audience that might be okay. Good rule of thumb, great rule of thumb for pretty much everything, but especially here. Go with how the individual wants to identify and have other people's refer to them. So I said before, make sure that you grow in your knowledge, that you're in a certain place in your knowledge before you use the word queer fluidly in conversations. If someone identifies themselves as being gender queer, that's a pretty big implication that that's also how they want others to identify them. So in that case, you can say, when it's appropriate in conversation, not just randomly for no reason, oh yeah, so-and-so is genderqueer, type of a thing. That is basically giving not only permission, but very, very much requesting that's how that person be addressed. So just be aware that there are community only words. There are also words that are not necessarily community only, but you got to know when to use them. So I hope that this was helpful for getting some clarification on some words. If you want more, because we definitely did not cover everything in regards to this population, please feel free to email your questions at the email posted here. Also, please let us know what you thought of today, in addition to questions you might have about anything covered, any concerns, disagreements. If you want to chat with me for a little while about anything today, if you would like resources on how to learn more, you want a part 2, anything like that at all, please feel free to email us. Thank you again so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you have a wonderful day.